The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Module 5, Understanding People and Their Personalities. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard loud and clear. So could I just ask you over in the question box if you could just type in the word clear. That just lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. That would be great. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, John. Thanks, Leslie. Okay, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. All right, well, we're going to have some fun with this topic, although there's a serious underlying point to this topic, and that is that what I'm suggesting to you is that we should be treating people how they want to be treated rather than treating people how we want to be treated. So in other words, it's not the golden rule, which is, of course, treat people how you want to be treated. It's actually using the platinum rule, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. All right, so I hope you've had a chance to complete the diagnostic that I sent you. And so what I want to do during this hour is really debrief you on that diagnostic and give you a few tips and hints on the 4 different personality types and help you become more flexible when you're dealing with those different personality types. All right, as usual, if you've got questions or comments or observations, type them in the question box there and I'll be happy to answer them as we go through the hour. And of course, you'll receive a copy of the recording of this presentation and the slides as well. Okay, so just before we launch into the topic, let's just do a little bit of preliminary work. You'll recall, of course, that we've covered 5 or 4 topics now, and we're up to number 5. So I hope that you've been able to build on each topic and be able to apply some of the skills that you've learned. And what we should be doing here is progressively building up our skill base based on the information that I've sent you. So, and of course today is no different, and I'll be giving you some homework at the end of this presentation as well. All right, so your homework last time, of course, was to think about Daniel Pink's concept of mastery, autonomy, and purpose. He basically said that in order to get the best out of other people, particularly knowledge workers, what we should be trying to do is give them the opportunity to be autonomous, that is, to work out for themselves how they'll get their work done, to provide them with developmental opportunities to help them build their skill set, not just now, but for the future. And purpose is really about the why, as Simon Sinek talks about. Why am I asking you to do this? What is the big picture perspective of this task and how does it make a difference? And I hope you've been consciously trying to do that in your work. And if you have, I'm hoping you're getting some good results from it, because essentially what Daniel Pink was saying, and I agree with him, is that the carrot and the stick doesn't really work with knowledge workers. It might work in a production area, but it doesn't work particularly well with people who've got a breadth of experience or knowledge. So I hope you've had a chance to apply some of that in your work in the due course. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a couple of things. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of personality and how it's evolved over the last 25 to 30 years. We'll talk about understanding personality traits, and in particular, I'll refer to the model that I shared with you and got you to complete. Now, there's lots and lots of those out there. There's MBTI and DISC and a whole range of other models. You'll find that I've used animals to describe personality types because it's very simple and very easy. So when I say to you a bull, it's kind of fairly clear in your mind the sort of traits of what a bull would exhibit. And that's why I've used animals in this approach. I'm going to talk about some of the application tools you can use when you're dealing with that type of personality. And I'm going to finish up again where I started by talking about the platinum rule rather than the golden rule. In other words, treat people how they want to be treated. And if you do that, you'll find you'll get much better results. Okay. So what we're doing here, I guess, is giving you a chance to start to reflect on personality. So it's really about providing you with a fun and practical tool for understanding yourself and the other people and others that you deal with. And this could be managing upwards, it could be managing your team, it could be managing your colleagues, whoever it might be that you come in contact with, your stakeholders, your customers, your clients, whoever it might be, this information is applicable right across the board. Okay, so I'm just conscious that we may not have any vision on the screen. Is that the case? Could someone indicate that to me? I'm getting some feedback here that the screens aren't coming up, but maybe the audio is still working. So just in the question box, could somebody give me a hint on whether or not that's coming through loud and clear? Okay, that's great. Good. It's just me, not you. Which is great. Okay, so yes, whilst we're going to have a bit of fun today, and we're going to look at some personality types, there is a clear message in this that's important for our purposes of dealing with other people. And as I said earlier, I'm going to use 4 different animals: owls, lambs, bulls, and peacocks. And you'll probably recall when you completed the survey, you would have got 4 total scores. And those total scores give you some indication of some of the characteristics that you might exhibit for that particular personality type. So you might find, of course, and in fact, I'd be very surprised if this wasn't the case, that when you completed it, it was highly unlikely that you would have got 40 points in one particular column. It's likely, of course, that we're all a combination of all 4 personalities. But Carl Jung was the first person that came up with this concept. Now, Carl Jung he was the first psychologist that came up with the notion of personality types. It was highly controversial in its time because people said, well, you can't really categorize people according to personality. And of course, he came up with this theory that you could. And so since then, we've built on that, and there seems to be some validity to this. And so therefore, it's quite popular that people talk about different personality types, even in the 21st century. But where does the word personality come from? Well, personality comes from the Greek word persona, which essentially means mask. So what it means is that each of us has a mask. It's our way of looking at the world through this mask. And the question, of course, is whether this mask is something that is innate. Are we born with it, or is it is it environmental? Is it shaped by the environment, or are we born with it, or is it a combination of both? Now, psychologists have been wrestling with this question for many, many years, and they have changed their view several times. And of course, we can't sort of prove or disprove it one way or the other. But many, many years ago, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, the whole notion was that you're a product of your environment. So that personality was shaped by the environment and the influences that you came in contact with in the environment. And then the pendulum swung very much the other way to say that personality was an innate predisposition. In other words, we're born with a personality, not necessarily hereditary, but we are born with a personality. And those of you that have young children would probably recognize that in those young children, there's a personality already formed. And you might say, well, where did that come from? So I think there's some validity to that theory. And now the latest research, which is the neuroplasticity research, shows that the brain changes and forms as we grow. And so therefore there is an argument, and the pendulum swung back somewhat to the idea that personality is an environmental predisposition. So we can shape and change our personality depending on what happens to us in the environment we're working in. So you can be the judge of that yourself. But I think it's fair to say that all of us have personality traits that we tend to exhibit. And when people are under a lot of pressure, so when stress takes over our personality traits are accentuated. And the reason for that is very simply this, that because we're feeling vulnerable at the time, we will protect ourselves with this mask that we carry around with us. And so therefore, when somebody's very much under pressure and they're an extrovert, they're likely to be very talkative. Or if someone's under a lot of pressure and they're an introvert, they'll go within their shell. So I think that's fairly true for most of us. Now, let me share with you the profile so you can understand how it all works. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about each of these 4 animals in a bit more detail. So you've got a typical 2x2 matrix. And up the top here, you'll notice that I've got 2 key words, introvert and extrovert. And of course, we use these words a lot. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding about these words. At its very basic level, what introversion and extroversion really means is how you recharge your batteries. So generally speaking, introverts will recharge their batteries by being on their own. And extroverts, on the other hand, will recharge their batteries by engaging in conversations with people. So that's all it is. It's got nothing to do with whether you're a good leader or, that extroverts happen to have better emotional intelligence. All of that's nonsense. It's really about the revitalization and recharging of your batteries. So, for example, I'm more on the introvert side, and because of that, after I've done a day's workshop, what I want to do is just quietly withdraw, read a book, or perhaps watch some television or something. I'm not all that interested in talking to people because I'm trying to recharge my batteries. But an extrovert might be different, and they'll be energized by that and probably want to continue the conversation with other people. Now, all of us are probably a combination between introvert and extrovert, and it really depends on the circumstances we're in or how we're feeling. But if you look at your profile, if you've got it in front of you, and if you look at your owl and your lamb scores and you just add them up, so if you add up the column that says owl, that's the total score, and you add up your column that says lamb, that gives you an indication of what your introversion score is. And equally, if you add up your bull and your peacock score, that will give you your extrovert score. And that'll give you some sense of whether you're more introverted than extroverted. And if you're right smack bang in the middle, that's fine. It means that in certain occasions you are more introvert, and other occasions you're more extrovert. It might depend on who you're talking to or how much you've had to drink or all sorts of possibilities. So that's the first interesting dimension in the profile. Now the other dimension on the right-hand side is the one around task and people. So generally speaking, we know that certain personalities have more of a task focus and certain personalities have more of a people focus. Now, obviously, they're both important in a leadership context. You've got to get certain tasks done in your workplace, which is obvious, but you've also got to work with and through other people in order to get those tasks done. So they're both important, but the owl and the bull will tend to be orientated towards getting tasks done, whereas the lamb and the peacock will be more focused on the people dimension of the task. So if you, again, add up your owl and your bull scores on your profile, right, if you just add them up in your head, and you add up your lamb and your peacock scores, it'll give you an indication of whether you're more task or people oriented. And that, of course, is always interesting. So in other words, the owls and the bulls will be focused on getting the task done and then socializing, whereas the lambs and the peacocks will be more interested in building rapport up and socializing as a means of achieving the task. So they're the 2 key dimensions in the profile. And then if I just populate this a little bit more and put the 4 animals in, it defaults to these 4 different personality types. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit more about their characteristics, but you can sort of get a quick sense of where you are on the profile. Now, as I said before, there are many of these out there, and these profiles pretty much fit the same sort of model. It's just I'm using animals because it's a simpler concept to understand the difference between owls, bulls, lambs, and peacocks. So that's the model in its totality. And so let's go through, and I'm going to go in the order that it is on the profile. So if we actually look at the peacock personality to start with, and try and understand the peacock personality, let's look at a couple of features of the peacock. The first important feature of the peacock is that if there's one word that describes the peacock, it's popularity. So in other words, what the peacock's primary motivation is being popular. They like to be liked. And leaders that like to be liked sometimes have a lot of trouble, uh, giving negative feedback because they're concerned that by doing that, they may not be liked. And of course, it's impossible for everybody to like you. So all of these primary motivations that I'm sharing with you are ideals. You can never actually achieve them, but they all start with P, and the first one is popularity. So the characteristics of the peacock is they're very outgoing, very extrovert. They're talkers, and the glass is usually half full, not half empty. So they're pretty much optimistic by nature. So in meetings, they'll do a lot of talking. They'll engage in lots of interaction with other people. They'll go out of their way to disclose information about themselves, and they're not particularly private people. And I'm sure in your team, you've got some people who exhibit those characteristics. They usually got the joke of the week. They'll come to work. And interestingly enough, of all the personalities, the peacock is the one that can probably get away with the most work as far as, because they're engaging, they're fun to be around. And people often dismiss their behaviour on the basis that, they're just who they are and so forth. So people can get away with that. So their great strengths are that they have appealing personalities. People find them amusing and fun to be around. So, for example, my best friend's a peacock, wonderful person to have a drink with or a meal with. They'll have a lot of stories. They'll make you laugh. They're always engaging. There's never a dull moment. They're usually quite creative and colourful as well. So the typical Hollywood movie star, for example, would very much fit this bill. They're energetic and enthusiastic, lots of energy, and they're usually quite inspiring because they're usually, as I said before, optimistic. The glass is half full, not half empty. So that gives you some indication of their strengths. And a couple of famous people that would fit this bill very clearly are Paris Hilton. Now, Paris Hilton, of course, is very much an extrovert, and she, you may recall, many years ago went to prison for not paying taxes. I don't think she spent long in prison, but what she did do is she made it a publicity stunt. She reminded everyone that she was going to prison, and she got a lot of publicity for that. I don't know about you, but if I had to spend any time in prison, I'd probably just do it very quietly, do my time, come out and regroup, but not Paris Hilton because of that extroverted nature. Now, those of you who are familiar with Billy Connolly, the great Scottish comedian, would be aware that when he's being interviewed or when he's doing a show, he doesn't have any structure at all. What he does is he just comes in and one tangent leads to another, and there is this ebb and flow of stories. And I remember reading his biography, and he claims that he doesn't really prepare. He doesn't have a very clear sense of what he's going to talk about when he's on the stage. It just comes out, which is incredible for somebody like myself to think that someone would do that. But that's how the peacock thinks. And really, the peacock, if you could put a motto to them, it would be this: any publicity is good publicity. So the classic movie star in Hollywood would probably be depressed if they didn't get any publicity, whether it's accurate or not is a completely different perspective. So they just want to be in the news, they want to be in the gossip columns, and that's very important to them. So I'm sure you would be aware of people that you interact with that are peacocks, and I'd be keen to hear whether or not you know, how you deal with them. You yourself might be a peacock as well. So let's look at the bull. Now, the bull, as a personality, is still an extrovert. So they've still got something in common with the peacock. In other words, they're outgoing by nature. So their primary motivation is power. Now, of course, you can't be powerful in all situations, but what the bull is trying to do is to retain some sense of authority and power. Now, they have an insecurity about them, as we all do with our personalities, in the sense that they're concerned they're going to be taken advantage of. So in order not to be taken advantage of, what the bull will attempt to do was take control. So they can be accused of being quite bossy, and they can be accused of being a control freak. And I'm sure you know people like that as well. So their characteristics are, as I said, they're extrovert like the peacock, but they're doers. They've normally got 15 balls in the air at once. They're juggling. Sometimes a few of those balls fall to the ground, but they usually take on more than they can handle. Sitting still for any period of time is not really their forte, but like the peacock, they're also optimists. They believe that whatever it is that they do can be done, and they love a challenge, and they'll take on a challenge wherever they can. So their great strengths is that they're born leaders. Now, by that, I don't mean that you need to be a bull in order to be a good leader. That's not, in fact, the case. So please don't think that. But the bull, of all the four personalities, is the one who feels most comfortable in a leadership role. So they will gravitate to leadership roles for the simple reason that they don't want to be taken advantage of. They're very goal focused, and the way to manage them, of course, is to give them a very clear insight into what you want achieved, but not to give them the details about how to get there. So they will respond very well to a very clear goal, and because they enjoy the challenge, they'll get off and get it done, and they'll get it done reasonably quickly. It might be a bit rough around the edges, but it'll be done. So they move quickly into action, very quick to move into action, and this is a very important trait of a bull. One of the things that frustrates a bull is people procrastinating or not being able to get to the point. So the last thing you want to do with a bull is give them all the details. They don't need the details, they don't want the details, they just simply need to know the bottom line. They'll often use that phrase, bottom line, in order to get what they need. So two famous personalities that fit the mold here are Madonna and Hillary Clinton. Now, Madonna, of course, has managed her career from the word go, and she, through great odds, has achieved enormous success. And she's still producing records even today, when most of us would just be relaxed and sitting on a beach and enjoying ourselves, but not Madonna. She's always striving to achieve, and can be very forthright, not really interested in chit-chat, and gets very much to the point. Now, Hillary Clinton is exactly the same. Hillary Clinton doesn't believe in being popular. She believes in getting things done. And, of course, in the last presidential election, it was all about policies and how she's going to achieve certain successes against the current president when she was up in that election. So those two are classic bulls and very much fit the mold. And the point I'm trying to make here also is that people often say to me, are males or females more predisposed to any of these personalities? Absolutely not. That's a myth. Bulls can just as much be female as male. There is absolutely no distinction that can be made there at all. So if you actually divided the population up in the world, you'd probably come up with about 25% bull, 25% owl, 25% lamb, and 25% peacock. And within those 25 percentage groups, you'd have probably reasonable amount, even male and female. So their motto as a bull is, I'm in control and I'm willing to lead. So this is very much the case with the bull. So giving them a sense of responsibility, explaining to them clearly and firmly what you expect is exactly the best way to get the best out of the bull personality. And of course, if you take a backward step with a bull, they'll often move into your space and invade your space. But if you actually spoke to them privately about it and said, why are you doing that? They'll often say to you, it's because there's a vacuum of leadership there and somebody has to get the job done. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to jump in and do it, which is quite an honourable intent, but it doesn't come across that way when you're on the receiving end of a pushy bull. Okay, the next two personalities are introvert personalities, and the first one I'm going to touch upon is the owl. Now, the primary motivation for the owl is being perfect. Again, it's impossible to be perfect as a human being, and the owl will strive to be perfect. So what will happen with the owl is they'll often take too long to get things done. And the reason they take too long and don't meet deadlines necessarily is because they're trying to do it perfectly. It is very important for them to get the perfect solution, write the perfect report, have the perfect interaction with the customer, give the perfect advice, whatever it might be. Their characteristics, as I mentioned, are introvert, so they'll tend to be reasonably private. They won't, and I should say, I mentioned the Hollywood star before. There is another type of actor, and that is the introvert, who is more the method actor, the one who is trying to play the role perfectly. So a Keanu Reeves, for example, would be more prone to being an introvert and an owl. And he's still obviously a famous actor. He's not interested in publicity. He just wants to do the job as well as he possibly can. They're usually deep thinkers, and what happens is that they'll often think through very carefully. I remember talking to someone the other day who happened to be an owl, and I was having a coaching session with them, and I said, how's it all going? And they said, oh, something strange happened this morning. I said, what was that? And they said, well, somebody, whoever it was, said hello to me this morning. And I said, oh, why is that strange? And they said, well, they've never done that before. And I said, well, maybe they were just in a good mood on that morning. I said, oh, no, something's very strange going on there. They want to read into situations a lot more complexity than what perhaps is already there. And of course, as I mentioned, the glass is half full, not half empty, not half full. So they tend to be very good at risk mitigation. So look at situations and give feedback about how something could be done better, faster, easier. And it can come across as whinging or negative attitude, but in actual fact, what's happened is that the owl has actually thought it through very carefully. And because they've thought it through very carefully, they've often got a very in-depth solution to a problem that might be available, might need to be resolved. So a couple of strengths about them is they're very schedule oriented. So owls like to know, they like to plan their day. They're natural list makers. They'll probably have a to-do list. They'll probably expect people to start on time and finish on time. They've got very high standards, and interesting enough, it's not just of other people, but it's true. They do have high standards of other people, but they also have high standards of themselves. So they expect very high rate of work from themselves. So owls are actually their own worst critic. They'll often put themselves down, and sometimes a leader has to lift them up. So they're very orderly and organised and very systematic. They know where everything is in their workstation. They know where they can find reports on their computer. They love to have folders and files and systems and processes. So the owl becomes a very organised person because of that perfectionist streak. So two personalities that fit that bill very well are Roger Federer, the great tennis player, and Leonardo da Vinci, the great artist. Roger Federer, of course, is still playing at the top level, and Roger Federer practices harder than any other tennis player in that bracket of top-notch tennis players. He is a perfectionist. He's always trying to improve his game, and he probably always will. And the other person that's interesting, and they're not around anymore, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci. And you can see on your screen there some very famous pictures of the human body, and you might recall studying those at school. And what Leonardo da Vinci actually did is he went into a graveyard, and in those days, I guess you couldn't get a permit from the local government, but he went into a graveyard and he dug up some bodies, and he actually cut them, he dissected them. And what he was trying to do was to actually get the perfect depiction of the muscular system of the human body, hence the great detail in those sketches that you see on your screen. So that's a perfectionist at its extreme level. So their motto in life is that, how can I paint this perfect picture? So they're all about doing the work perfectly. So if you criticise an owl for shoddy standards, first of all, you probably won't have to. The criticism will probably be more around getting the work done on time. But criticising an owl for shoddy standards is probably not going to be well received. And the reason for that is they're their own worst critic. They probably know where they've slipped up. They probably know where the mistakes are made, and they've probably beaten themselves up about those mistakes as well. So that's the owl. Now, the final one in the series is the lamb. Now, the lamb personality is also an introvert, and their key primary motivation in life is being peaceful. So they'll do everything they can to make sure that they don't rock the boat. So they'll placate arguments. They will steer away from conflict. They won't want to confront people about their behaviour if they happen to be a leader. Their whole intent is to make sure that there's harmony and peace in the workplace. But again, like the other three Ps, that's an ideal. Two people on a desert island will come to blows, or come to at least have an argument at some point. So it's impossible that you can always be in peaceful situations in the workplace. But nevertheless, the lamb will strive for that. So it's important for the lamb to make sure, if you're leading them, that you create a harmonious rapport with them and make sure that you work with them rather than against them. So if you look at their characteristics, like the owl, they are introvert by nature, so they're fairly private people. And in fact, they pride themselves on being private people. So they won't give away too much about their life and what they do outside work. They're watchers, so what will often happen in a meeting is that they'll wait for several people to give their comment or their feedback, and once they feel it's safe, they'll jump in and give their feedback if they feel it's worthy. But they'll often wait for others to do that before they do that. But like the owl, they're pessimists, so they will tend to see the negative rather than the positive. And usually the lamb is not terribly flamboyant as a personality. Their clothing is quite standard. They'll dress for comfort, for example, not for style. And they're pretty laid back, and it takes a while to get them wound up and motivated, and it can be a source of frustration for those peacocks who are always inspirational. So their great strengths are that they're competent and steady. So if you give a lamb a job and you clearly explain what's expected of them, they will often get the job done, and they'll get it done without any great fuss or fanfare, which is great. But provided, of course, you don't put too much pressure on them. They're usually very peaceful and agreeable, and so they're inoffensive, and often people enjoy their company because in no way do they find them threatening. The lamb will go out of their way not to be threatening, and that's the whole purpose of that. So lambs will often make very good administrators. they usually can be very good in a sales environment because they can build rapport in a way, and they'll mediate problems. So, if two people have got a conflict going on with different points of view, the lamb can often see both sides of the equation and can often give their feedback on that. So, two famous people that fit the mold here are Keanu Reeves, who I mentioned earlier as the great Hollywood actor, and Kirsten Stewart, who's also a Hollywood actor. Now, both of those two actors are great actors. No one can doubt that. But what's interesting about that is that they don't seek out publicity. The only time that you'll see Keanu Reeves or Kirsten Stewart in a media conference or talking to somebody in the media will be because they're obliged to promote a movie. They will not go out of their way to be the centre of attention. And Keanu Reeves often complains about living in New York, and when he goes off to a park and has a sandwich to eat, he gets very annoyed because the paparazzi will often take his picture in the park when he's just privately sitting there having a sandwich. He really doesn't like all the fanfare and publicity that goes with being a Hollywood actor. And Kirsten Stewart's no different. So both of those two, as you can see, are famous people who really don't enjoy the fame part of that equation. They're really in it because they enjoy what they do, and they're doing it for that reason, not in any way, shape or form to gain any sort of publicity as such. So there's the four personalities. I'm just going to see if there's any questions that anyone's got or any comments that anyone wants to make about any of those four personalities. I just got a question here from someone asking about opposites. Do opposites have the most conflict? That's a great question. Yes, it's actually quite true that peacocks and owls will often be, they won't often see eye to eye. So, for example, the peacocks will be very outgoing and very extrovert, whereas the owls, of course, will be introvert and very focused on the task. In actual fact, they can work really well together if they're put in that position, provided they understand what each of them brings to the table. That can be working really well in their favour as well. So, and of course, the same is true for the bulls and the lambs. The bulls will often try, they're quite dominant and quite forceful, and the owls, of course, are quite, the lambs are quite peaceful and quiet, and the lambs can often be intimidated by the bulls, and the bulls can often be frustrated by the lambs for the very reasons that they're opposite on the equation. But the key thing, I think, here is that, again, they can work very well together if they understand the differences in the personality and what both can bring to the table in relation to resolving an issue or a problem in the workplace. So, good question. I think it's true, Amy, that the opposites, and the interesting thing about relationships is we often find people in relationships are opposite. So peacocks and owls and lambs and bulls will often get into relationships, and that becomes very, very, that's very common. And often when they're in that relationship, what they're trying to do is change the other person once they get into that relationship. So it is very true that opposites do attract, as they say, but often they can also be quite, it can be a source of frustration as well for both parties. Okay, now let's talk about getting the best out of these personalities. Well, first of all, the lamb's overriding objective is peace is the overriding objective. So they're doing everything they can not to rock the boat. So let's talk about you as the leader now and what you need to do. Obviously, you fit into one of these four personality profiles, but what you need to do is to be aware of who you're dealing with and try and deal with them according to how they want to be dealt with. Now, if you do that effectively, you'll find you'll get much better results. So, for example, if you look at the peacock, recognise that they will occasionally have a challenge with following through. They can get easily distracted, and they've usually got a short attention span. And what you need to do is to send them reminders, send them updates, give them a schedule, and make sure that they're running on a train track so that they themselves can get the work done and give you progress reports all the way through. That's the key thing, and they'll appreciate that if you do it in a way that's not too intrusive. They will appreciate that. I realise that sometimes they talk first before they think. In fact, you'll often find that the peacocks will say that I'm just thinking aloud, and that's how they think. So when they're actually in a meeting, their thinking is actually going on at the same time they're talking, whereas the owls and the lambs will often think first and then speak later, whereas the peacocks will speak first and then think later. So what that means, of course, is the peacock's most likely to say things that perhaps are undiplomatic, or perhaps things that are insensitive or perceived that way. They don't actually mean to hurt. They're just blurting out the first thing that comes into their head. So you need to indulge them in a thinking process by talking with them. Realise they do thrive on variety and flexibility. So boring, mundane work is not going to be the forte of the peacock. So they need variety. They need to feel that there's a sense of engagement in a number of different issues with people. And if they've got a number of projects they're working on and they're doing that with and through other people, they'll probably be at their best. I know you can't always do that in the work that you do, but be conscious of it and be aware of it. Don't expect them to remember appointments or be on time. They're not good at keeping schedules. They're not good at having a Google Calendar with color codes. They're not good at making lists. And so as a result of that, they'll often forget appointments or turn up on the wrong day or whatever. And, that's just the way they are. So trying to get them completely organised is not necessarily going to be an easy thing to do. So just be aware that they will have problems with those issues. And of course, be prepared to hear their stories. They'll always have a really amusing story to tell you, something that'll probably make you laugh, and sometimes that's fine. And I think what you've got to do is just be patient with them and accept that until you've heard their story, it's very hard to get down to business. They'll be eager and anxious to tell you their story because they're extrovert. And I think you just got to accept that. Now, with the bull's personality, realise, of course, that they're comfortable about being in charge. So they like being in control. So therefore, giving them a sense of autonomy and giving them ownership of a project probably will fit their personality very well, because that's what they want to do anyway. So if you micromanage a bull, you're not likely to get good results because you're cramping their style. So give them a very clear objective of what you want them to achieve. Ask them to report back on a regular basis, and you'll find that they'll get the job done reasonably well. Insist on two-way communication. So I think the big misunderstanding with the bull is we often feel that we've got to take a step back. They can sometimes come across as intimidating. I don't think they intentionally do that. It's just how they come across. And the key thing for you, if you're not a bull, is not to take a step back, but just firmly remind your colleague that what their responsibility is and what your responsibility is, and insist on a two-way dialogue. They will respect you for that, actually, despite what you might think. They also don't mean to hurt you, and what they will tend to do is they're not into chit-chat or small talk, so trying to make small talk with a bull is really a futile exercise. Just accept that they want to get down to business very quickly. So they'll always pride themselves on calling a spade a spade. And sometimes when someone calls a spade, of course, it can offend the other person deeply. So just realise that can happen. in different situations. They're not actually out trying to hurt anybody. They just probably haven't thought about it, and they're eager to get the task done, as I mentioned earlier. So the important thing when you're dealing with a bull is be firm and fair and to the point. If you're firm and you're fair and you're to the point, the bull will respond extremely well to that, because they'll see a mirror image of themselves if you lead them that way. So don't back down. Be very firm, be very fair, and make it very clear what you're expecting of them in terms of the project or whatever it is that you're working on. Realise that they're not noted for their outward displays of compassion, so they're highly unlikely to burst into tears when you're giving them feedback. And there's a good reason for that, because the bull doesn't want to be, the bull, it's vulnerability, isn't it? If I start crying or I seem like I'm hurt, then of course I've lost control, or at least momentarily, and a bull won't do that. So it doesn't mean they're not compassionate. They are compassionate. It's just that they don't show it. And that's a big misunderstanding of the bull personality as well. Now, the owl personality is one of the most interesting personalities of all. If you're dealing with an owl personality, they're not that easy to lead, I must say. Let's talk a little bit about how to get the best out of the owl. Of all the four personalities, the owl is the one that's most likely to get hurt. So they're very sensitive, and the reason they're very sensitive is they think things through too deeply, and they read into situations too much. So you could probably say that most conspiracy theorists are owl by nature. They'll often think things through, and so be careful with that. And what happens is that when you hurt an owl, they'll usually sulk. That's the big indicator. And the sulk will go on for days, it could go on for months, or indeed it could go on for years. So the owl is a specialist in sulking. So if you've got someone that's quite sulky in your workplace, it's probably likely that they fit the bill of the personality of the owl. Realise they're programmed for with a mindset that assesses risk. So when they point something out to you about how the room should be set up, or how the agenda should be done, or how the report should be written, they're not just blurting that out for no reason. They've actually thought very carefully about it, and it'd be good for you to actually listen to what they have to say, because they've often thought through the risks associated with how something's done. So that can be harnessed and utilised in your workplace. Be prepared to answer their questions. They don't expect you to be frivolous. They do want the facts, they want the logic, they want the depth of argument behind something. They don't just want you to sort of give a superficial explanation about how something should be. They do want you to go into detail about that, and it's important that you do that. Of the four personalities, the owl is the one that reads the fine print. They want to know the details, and it's important that you give them the details. And if you give them the details, it'll precipitate more questions, and it'll kind of get you more and more frustrated. But until they've had all their questions answered, you're not going to get the best out of them. And that's because they're perfectionists and they want to do it the right way. And in order to do it the right way, they need to know as much about it as they probably can. Try to keep a reasonable schedule. They won't appreciate sloppy timekeeping. If the meeting started 20 minutes late or even early, which is worse, they won't be too appreciative of that. Or if the meeting goes on longer than it should, they won't appreciate that either. So try to keep a reasonable schedule with the owl. And realise that when you're arguing with an owl, make sure your opinions are backed up with substance. If they can see that you've done your homework and you've thought through very carefully about the proposition that you're making, they'll be highly likely to accept that. But they do want to see evidence of that, and that becomes really important. Okay, so that's the owl. Now, the lamb, the last personality. of the four. So lambs, of course, are also introverts, and lambs they realise that they need to be clear about the direction you're heading. So it's quite reasonable for you to impose a goal and a direction with the lamb. In fact, they respond very well to that. Don't leave them to their own devices. So the whole purpose of that is to give them some very clear train tracks to run on. And if you do that, then they'll respond well to that because they don't want to rock the boat. Remember, they're conflict adverse. So what they want to do is they want to do it right. But in order to do it right, they want to make sure they know what right looks like. So you have to explain it clearly. So not only do you need to explain the goal, you probably also need to explain the process that you expect as well. Help them to set agreed upon targets. So they're not great on goal setting like the bulls. So they actually need you to set very crystal clear targets for them to achieve, and not unrealistic targets either, but targets that can be achieved. And if you set them targets that can be achieved, they'll respond well to that. Because, of course, they know where they stand. But your job is to give them those targets. Don't expect them to show outward signs of enthusiasm. They often don't wear that on their shirt sleeve. Often what will happen is the lamb will look bored at work. They'll look very laid back. It'll take a lot to get them very, very excited about something. And even then, they may not show it. So, because they're private people and they don't necessarily want to show that to you, and that's okay as long as you realise that. So the lambs aren't going to be as demonstrative, for example, as the peacocks. Realise that putting things off is their quiet form of control. So if you give a job to a lamb and they don't follow through, then it's probably likely that they're being stubborn. But they're not actually saying to you, I'm not going to do this, or I'm not going to do it your way, or I don't agree with this, which is, of course, what the bull would say to you. The lamb will just quietly put it in the too hard basket and just hope that it goes away. And what they're doing is they're using that stubborn streak that they have in order to maintain some sense of control in the workplace. But they won't make a song and a dance about it. So if you come across that, you probably know what's going on. And what you need to do with the lamb, because remember the people dimension is more important than the task dimension, is look for mutual commitments. Ask the lamb for their commitment. As I said earlier in this series, when you can do that for all the personalities, but ask for mutual commitment. I'll do this. We've agreed on that. If you can follow through on this. So give them an opportunity to be able to make some commitments to you. And if you do that, they'll follow through on those commitments. And the reason is very simple. They don't want to rock the boat. They know that the consequences of not following through on a commitment could be you getting upset with them. And they don't want that to happen. So if you can get them to make commitments, you're a long way ahead. All right, so this probably brings us pretty much to the close of our session today, but I just wanted to make the point, what are we doing with all of this information? If you're leading people, the important thing is to practice what I call the platinum rule. Now, the platinum rule is treat people how they want to be treated. Don't use the golden rule, which is treat people how you want to be treated. Now, what I mean by that is, of course, in terms of standards and expectations and all of those sorts of things, of course, treat everybody the same. But in terms of the way you go about dealing with the different personalities, then you need to be flexible. So, with the bulls, it's a completely different ball game to the owls. So it's very important to try as much as you can to try to flex your personality to meet the needs of the other person. And if you can do this, you'll find you'll get really great results. And it's quite a surprise to people when they realize this. And so, you can imagine what your homework's going to be. It's about looking around the office and working out where do people fit in. You've got the survey, of course, and you're most welcome to use that as an opportunity to give people a chance to complete the survey. And by all means, what's wrong with having a conversation and a bit of fun with your own team around those personality types? You can do that. That's part of the Lunch and Learn series. It's available for you, that diagnostic. So have a bit of a laugh about it. Don't take things too seriously, and just try to realize that all of these personalities have different orientations and different approaches to dealing with perhaps similar problems. And if you try to do that well, you'll get good results. And be very conscious of your own way of leading. Now, think about your own personality. How does that guide and inform the way you lead other people? And what might you do? So, for example, if you're a bull, could you just soften the edges a bit and involve yourself in a bit of chit-chat with other people, even though that's not something that feels natural for you? Or if you're an owl, could you lighten up a little bit and just accept that near enough is good enough occasionally? Or if you're a peacock, just realise that you shouldn't really be dominating the conversation, and perhaps getting other people to speak up, it might be the way to go. And if you're a lamb, just realise that occasionally there's going to be conflict in the workplace, and it's okay, it's not earth-shattering, and as long as it's done in a respectful way, such as giving feedback on performance, you're likely to get a good result. Okay. So I don't think there's any other questions there by the look of it. So look, your homework, as I've mentioned to you, is try to approach people that you lead with an emphasis on the personality types. So what I'd like you to try now is to have some fun with this afternoon, and actually look around the office and try to deal with people according to their personality type. Now, you might say to me, well, I'm not sure what personality this person is. And, with a bit of practice and a bit of thinking, you can work that out. But often it is hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because if they completed the profile, they'd probably have relatively even scores across all four. But if you look at people under pressure, you'll notice their personality coming to the fore. So for very private people, they're probably more likely to be owls or lambs. For very extrovert, outgoing people, they're more likely to be bulls or peacocks. So that's one indicator. How do they dress? How do they conduct themselves? How do they complete their work? All of these questions will give you clues as to what personality type they are. Okay, so that brings us pretty much to an end. Now, the last session we have together is around facilitating effective meetings. Now, that's important for you as a leader because we all spend too much time in meetings, and it's very important for all of us to learn to be more effective at running meetings. So I'm going to broach that subject in a fortnight, and I ask you to join us for that session so you can get much more effective and adept at running meetings. So folks, I might finish there. Thank you for the opportunity of working with you. I hope that you found that useful, and I hope that you can go out of here and start to communicate with your people even more effectively than you perhaps are already. So thank you. I wish you all the best. Have a really wonderful weekend, and I'll see you in a fortnight. Thank you very much, and goodbye.